I'm sending you this version of a Dvar Torah that I created in honor of Shabbat Hagadol on the eve of Pesach 2020. All our prayers are in plural. They're in Ashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu. Even if we didn't steal anything, we're still confessing to the act of stealing because it's collective. Except for Arami Oved Avi. In the Seder, the centerpiece of Haggadah, of Magid, is this portion of Bikurim, a testimony that each individual Jew will give at the Beit HaMikdash, identifying himself as Jewish. And he does it in singular, not in plural. And I believe this is a challenge for each of us to create an Arami Oved Avi in an individual basis. So I wanted to apply this concept to myself and to my family. Arami Oved Avi, the non-Jewish people sought to destroy my ancestors. And I'm going to use the example of my maternal grandparents, my mother's parents. My grandmother, Bubby, was born in 1895 in Belarus, which was then part of Russia. And when she was 15 years old, there was a pogrom in the city. She described it almost like an American cowboy western. Non-Jews, young adults, got drunk, rode horses into their shtetl, and shot up the town. So one of the bullets entered into their home and killed her brother immediately older than she was. She was the youngest of about 9 or 10 children, and Shmuel was dead. They sat Shiva, and immediately after the Shiva, the parents decided to send her to New York on her own to join her oldest brother, who lived in New York, in Brooklyn, in Williamsburg. So there she was, going to America at the age of 15, arriving here in the year 1910, already fleeing for her life, as times were very tough in East Europe. Around the same time, or a little later, my grandfather, in an area near to the shtetl where Bubby grew up, was drafted into the Russian army. That's not an easy task because the years of service was 25 years. And that was dismal and a drastic measure for any frum Jewish boy. So the family got together and they cut off his right thumb, thereby disqualifying him from serving in the army because he couldn't shoot a rifle. Another Jewish family in the same area who received an order to submit their son to the Russian army was trying to get their son excused, and they ratted on my grandfather and said this was done on purpose. So now the authorities were after my grandfather, and he, as an older teenager, fled for his life and arrived in America to the Lower East Side. Their two fathers met at a Yerid, at a conference for small businesses in Belarus. Each said, I have a child living in New York. I have a child living in New York. Let's write a letter to each of our children. They'll meet each other. Maybe they'll get married. So each received a letter from their father, but they didn't want to travel far. Let me just tell you that the Lower East Side is merely a walk across the Brooklyn Bridge to Williamsburg. It wasn't that far. They decided to meet on a Shabbat afternoon on the bridge, each accompanied by a family member, and they started to date and they got married. My mother, the oldest of the children, who was born in New York, and then at the age of 6 months old, the family moved to New Philadelphia, Ohio. I once asked my grandfather, how many Jews were there in New Philadelphia? He said, on a good day, there was the Mazumin. And each month we would travel to Canton to stock up on Jewish food, kosher food. They described that trip to me. I have no idea what vehicle they used. The year was 1915 or so. No, 1917, the year of my mother's birth. And it took 2.5 hours to go from New Philadelphia to Canton. Today, if you took the interstate, it takes 25 minutes. So they went every month. Bubby later would tell my wife, but she wouldn't tell me, the reason they went to Canton each month was that she needed to go to the mikveh. They were very frum, and they lived and they eked out a living. My grandfather owned a junkyard with a partner. I visited New Philadelphia not that long ago and found that junkyard. Today it's a truck repair lot. So they ended up having 3 children. My mother was the oldest, then a boy. The boy died at the age of 18 from spinal meningitis. Then they had a daughter. She lived 2 days and died near childbirth. So my grandmother had buried 2 children. My mother met my father in Washington, D.C. They married, got to move in Washington, and immediately my grandparents moved to Washington to be with their remaining daughter. There was nothing for them in New Philadelphia. And again, making a living was very, very difficult for my grandfather. He was the Baal Koreh in his shul. He worked as a mashgiach for the Vod, and he did other odds and ends, whatever came his way. And it was a difficult time. My Bubby, at the age of 35 or 40, had a Whipple operation for cancer. That's when they remove half your stomach and your pancreas. And the doctors gave her 6 months to live. 6 months to live. Bubby lived to the age of 88. She died in 1983. And she buried her husband, and she buried all 3 of her children. My mother died at the age of 41, dying of cancer. Bubby never complained. The only time I ever heard a word of complaint from her was when I brought Meira to meet my family in Washington. And we met, and we had Shabbat dinner Friday night. Meira and I walked her home to her apartment, and she started to cry. These were not tears of joy. They were tears of sadness. I said, Bubby, I bring my challah to you. Why do you cry? She said, I'm very happy for you. But Hashem took away all the people I would want to share my nachas with. Bubby lived a difficult life, but she had hope. I compared her to Naomi in the Ruth story. Naomi buried her husband and both her sons. And then in verse 12 of the first parak, it says, Amarti ki yesh tikva. I said there was hope for me. And Bubby lived that life of saying to herself, ki yesh tikva. There was hope. So she survived. She lived her life, but survived. And a very trying life, a difficult life, but one that she did the best she could. Was as a widow, she lived, she worked, she took her husband's place working as a mashgicha for the Vada Kashrus of Washington, D.C. This was the story of my grandparents, Arami Oved Avi. And the Parsha in Kitavo continues, and the end of the oral recitation that a Jewish person would give on bringing Bikurim, he would say, Vayivienu el hamakom hazeh, that God brought us to this place, to Yerushalayim, to the Beit HaMikdash, to a land flowing with milk and honey. I don't think my grandparents would have dreamt that would occur in their family. But right now, some of their great grandchildren are living in Israel. Great great grandchildren are being born in Israel. Last year, I took my grandfather's Megillah and I took it to Israel. We celebrated my granddaughter's bat mitzvah, and she read the Megillah for women, reading for the klaf the Megillah of her great great grandfather. Nothing gave me more joy than to see that experience and live it. And who knew that that would be the future for the offspring of my grandparents? Arami Oved Avi. Non-Jews tried to kill them. And they survived. And they thrived in the future of their descendants. Ki yesh tikva. Because they always had hope and never would relinquish that fervent belief in Hashem. We're living in difficult times. Whatever obstacles or stumbling blocks Hashem places in front of you and me, we all have them. But we have to express, in the words of Naomi, Ki yesh tikva. There's always hope. We will survive. We will survive this hidden virus of corona. And we'll be able to enjoy the Pesachs of the future. I believe that. I have the emunah that my Bubby possessed and instilled in all of us. She didn't preach Judaism to us. She role modeled Judaism for us. And that's the legacy that I take, and the legacy that I hope that I give to my grandchildren, children, and I hope maybe the future will hold great-grandchildren for me as well. But I want to wish you a bracha of surviving the virus, getting through this stage of turmoil and difficulty in the lives of all of us, so we can express a Chag Sameach, a Chag Bari V'Sameach, a life of good health and happiness for this Pesach and beyond. Shabbat Shalom.